Hey Louise. Hear us?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you. You still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
Good.
I've just presented you and we're very glad to have you, so welcome.
Thank you. So I can start. Is that
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yes, that's
Yes, okay, good. Then let me just share my slides. Voila. Do you see it?
Yes.
Perfect, okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry that I can't be here with you in person, but I'm happy to be able to connect with you online. So, as was already said, my name is Louise and I work for PICUM, so the platform for the international cooperation on undocumented migrants. I won't see you as I'm speaking because of the slides, but if there's any technical issue, just speak and then I will hear, or if there's any question. So for the next, 20, 25 minutes, I just want to take you through a bit of an overview of the EU's migration policies on undocumented migrants and how that's affecting the rights to health. But perhaps first, just a very brief couple of words about PICUM, who we are. So we are a network of organizations all working to ensure social justice and human rights for undocumented migrants. We are currently composed of 155 organizations across 34 countries, most of which are based in Europe, but we do have several organizations that are members from outside of Europe. And basically, in terms of how we work with our members to understand what's happening in the countries that they're working, to understand the needs, the challenges. We do research as well to complement the experiences of our members and to understand the realities for undocumented migrants. And based on this evidence, we advocate for evidence-based, holistic and humane responses to the realities of undocumented migrants, and for living in Europe and for people who want to come to Europe to work or for other reasons. So we really work with policymakers predominantly at the European and the international level as PICUM, as a secretariat, but together with our members, of course, we then support their work at the national and the local level. We have quite a lot of members. I just thought I can put a snapshot here of some of our members working on health. So of course, Rosengrenzka is one of our members, but we have many more across Europe. We have quite a variety, I would say, of the types of organizations that are within our network, from very big, let's say, organizations like Médecins du Monde or the Red Cross, to smaller grassroots organizations like Maisha in Germany that provide healthcare for undocumented migrants in Frankfurt, or Community Rights in Greece, which is led by the Ivorian community and other certain migrants working then to promote the rights of undocumented people. So quite a variety of members here working on health, but of course our PICUM works on a much broader set of priorities, not only on health. So we work on digital technologies, we work on detention and deportation, justice, labor, working conditions, labor rights, etc. So before going into, I guess, the sort of last part of the presentation, which is about the EU policies, I thought it might be useful to also provide a bit of an overview of the data that we have on undocumented migrants living in Europe, the data that we have on the health outcomes, although I think you'll be familiar with those, and a bit of data as well, the criminalization of solidarity. So as you, I'm sure, would know, of course, it's actually really hard to get a clear picture on the number of people that live undocumented in Europe. the estimates will vary considerably. But last year, a big research consortium across Europe provided updated, let's say, data on an estimate on how many irregular migrants would be residing in 12 European countries. So they estimated that that would be between 2.6 and 3.2 million irregular migrants were living between 2016 and 2023. So just so that it speaks a bit more, it's 1% of the overall population. So contrary to sort of the very widespread narratives on irregular migration, this is not a very sort of significant number when looking at the overall proportion of residents across the EU. And worth also to note that when compared to the very first data that we've had on the number of undocumented migrants, which is from 2008, there is no significant increase. So again, contrary to the widespread narratives and what we hear all the time, it's not a rising irregular migration that we're facing or that's happening. It's actually more or less always been the same proportion. I won't spend too much time on the poor health outcomes because I think probably these are ones that you would be really familiar with yourselves, but I thought it's still helpful to maybe give some data on it. For example, I think one thing that some Spanish researchers have been sort of promoting or coining a term is the sort of deportability syndrome, that they say people who are trapped in irregularity are facing. And I think it's important to use this term, deportability syndrome, because it describes the wide range of very physical manifestations of the sort of constant fear of deportation that undocumented migrants live in. So from palpitations, excessive sweating, difficulty breathing, sleep disorders, irritability, fatigue. So really a wide range of health issues that they face, which I think describes quite well the reality for undocumented migrants. Some other data would be that from France, there was a study a couple of years ago that said that 1 out of 6 undocumented migrants actually suffer from post-traumatic stress disorders, which is a rate that's 8 times higher than the general population in France. Then on detention as well, just some small data that you may also be familiar with, is that basically some research has shown that after just 1 month of residing in immigration detention, 1 out of 4 people reported poor health outcomes. And when again measured after 4 months, this is 3 out of 4 people that have poor health outcomes reported. Of course, the evidence shows that for a child, the impacts are much more harmful and long-term. So evidence shows that when a child is exposed to toxic stress, similar to that they can be facing in detention centers, they have a 3-fold relative risk of lung cancer during their lifetime, 3.5 times relative risk of some heart disease, and a life expectancy of up to 20 years lower than other children. But the effect doesn't really stop there. There's a genetic modification that can occur after the activation of this stress system, and that basically makes that the impact of this can be intergenerational. So with the next generation of children, that would show also negative outcomes. So from our point of view, of course, detention, the only solution would be abolition of detention as a public health intervention. And then on deportation procedures as well, to give a bit of data, it's a bit older, but I think it's still very much valid. This comes from the Institute of Race Relations that looked at data between 2010 and 2014, and they identified at least 123 deaths directly linked to migration policies. So people dying after jumping or falling while fleeing police pursuits, deaths caused by restraints used to silence them, forcibly removing, etc. Then on some data on the sort of criminalization of solidarity, as we call it. So criminalization of solidarity refers to the increased policing of people who help migrants, including through search and rescue operations, reception activities, or the provision of food, housing, and services. So it can really concern very different people that help, basically migrants, lifeguards, journalists, volunteers, NGOs, doctors, even migrants themselves. And PICUM for the last several years has been trying to monitor this criminalization of solidarity over time. So this we do through basically media monitoring and also through a network of volunteers that share with us the cases from their countries. And if we look at, let's say, the evolution over time since 2022, we see an increase in the number of people that are being criminalized for acting in solidarity with migrants. More specifically, just sort of looking at the data from last year, from 2024. So as was on the previous slides, we saw that there were 142 people being criminalized for acting in solidarity with migrants, and also 91 people criminalized for crossing borders. This data comes from 8 countries that were covered. It's just the countries that were basically where we found cases or where we were notified of cases. Most of the people would be accused of smuggling or facilitating irregular migration. And our count specifically covers cases where there were formal proceedings. Of course, there are going to be many more cases that are referring to intimidation, administrative sanctions, or non-judicial harassment across other countries. But here, for the purpose of this specific data, we're talking about formal proceedings against people. And in general, the trials are extremely long, but actually in practice most lead to acquittal or dismissal charges at the very final stage. But it's still the trials can take a long time, and the actions for which people are criminalized includes rescuing people in distress or alerting authorities of people in danger, providing assistance, or even civil disobedience. So, for example, protesting against a detention center. And then around, maybe just to highlight 2 case studies of what actually happens for this criminalization. So some cases from across Europe. One of them here that I've put on the slide is from France. So it's a former mayor who tried to help an undocumented residents. So basically, there was a person there who had been living in the town for nearly a decade, for nearly 10 years, while at the same time trying to regularize his status. The mayor offered him like temporary housing, lent him his car, and also provided some financial help. And then the mayor was found actually guilty of supporting an undocumented migrant, but the mayor didn't receive a specific sentence in the end. Or in Bulgaria, there were also some activists that were harassed as migrants were dying at the borders. So there were 7 volunteers that were arrested in 2024 while trying to help people at the Bulgarian-Turkish border. Others were being interrogated and threatened while helping migrants that were stranded. The authorities were trying to stop the rescue efforts, and in one tragic case, the police blocked access to 3 children in need of help, who then later froze to death. So even as the activists tried to recover the bodies, they faced harassment and detention. In the end, no charges were filed against them, but I think these events do highlight a broader pattern of repression. Moving on to just the right to health from a sort of European perspective. I think it's important to clarify or to sort of highlight that health is one of those policy areas where the EU and the member states share the competence. That is to say that basically, of course, the sort of healthcare system, how that's organized, how the services are developed, it's really something that is for the countries themselves to figure out on how they do it. The EU has no role to say in this. That said, in the Treaty of the European Union, there is very much a legal obligation for the EU to ensure that health considerations are included across all sectors, including within migration policy. So that's quite important because, as I'll get to the next slide, sorry, not the next slide, the next section of this presentation, there are the EU. We do consider that the EU's migration policies don't at all integrate health considerations, and that would go against, in that way, the treaty and also the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is a very strong legal obligation for the EU institutions and member states when they are implementing EU law. And within that, I'm sorry, maybe the light blue is not very clear on the slide, but basically, of course, within the Charter, there's Article 35, which puts in place the right of access to preventative care and benefits from medical treatment under national law. So there is an obligation to ensure the right to health for everybody. And then just maybe in terms of another legal instrument that's quite important, it would be the European Social Charter, which also requires states to effectively realize the rights, including taking appropriate steps to ensure the removal of the causes of ill health, provide preventative care, and ensure accessible healthcare services. So that's from, let's say, the EU level type of obligations. But in practice, so as I said, the healthcare systems are something that's defined at the national level. And we see that in the majority of cases, healthcare systems will largely exclude undocumented migrants. So we would consider that none of the member states have really fully achieved the WHO's, the World Health Organization's definition of universal health coverage. 9 countries have laws which do grant undocumented children the same access to health as national children in legislation. And we have, for several decades, we have had European countries like Belgium, Italy, France, and Portugal that had legislation in place to ensure that undocumented migrants can access necessary preventative and curative health care. And of course, we had also seen in the last couple of years countries like Sweden or Finland who had slowly, let's say, expanded sort of healthcare access or healthcare entitlements to undocumented migrants. But the reality is, whether we're talking about, again, Finland or Sweden or France or Portugal, more and more there is a pressure on instrumentalizing healthcare for return and deportation. So in France, there's currently a lot of push to remove what we call the sort of state medical aid. In Portugal, they also proposed some changes in legislation at the end of last year. So there's really a constant pressure on removing healthcare entitlements, but also, I think, involving professionals in the return proceedings. And even though, even in countries where there is the health service available as a matter of law, in practice, of course, extreme levels of barriers to prevent access to healthcare, whether these are administrative with very complex procedures, financial with large bills, or very simply the fear of deportation if you would access the health service that you're trying to access as an undocumented person. So that brings me to, let's say, the EU migration policy developments. And I'll focus mostly on the criminalization of migrants and solidarity, deportation and detention, and that's because these are the areas of work that we as PICUM focus on. I won't be covering the right to asylum, as this is not an area that we are working on as an organization, as there are other organizations that really focus and have an expertise on the asylum and the asylum system. In a nutshell, the migration policies of the EU aim to really foster a very hostile environment. So we see that the migration policies are all about limiting safe and regular migration pathways to come to Europe, putting in place extremely strict conditions for stay, so making it very difficult for people to live. Very complex and slow administrative procedures to obtain and renew their permits, which means that people will, sometimes be very much switching between being undocumented, having a short-term permit or like a precarious permit, then being undocumented, or failing to regularize their stay at all due to the difficult procedures. Also, as I mentioned already, very restricted access to social protection mechanisms and access to healthcare. And then all as a result also then having very strong enforcement measures based on deterrence and control. So policing, immigration detention, all with a view afterwards of increasing the deportation of people with an irregular situation. So that's, I'd say, in a nutshell, what the migration policies try to do, creating conditions hostile for migrants themselves that are more and more treated as criminals, viewed as a threat to national security, and at the same time actually also an hostile environment for those engaged in humanitarian action and solidarity efforts towards migrants. Here I just tried to put on the slides, I guess, 5 recent-ish policy developments from the last couple of years, because basically since about 2020, we can see that there are more and more proposals that are being proposed and adopted at the EU level that are all around this sort of hostile environment, criminalization of migration, and solidarity. So, for example, we have the facilitators package. This might be a very technical term, but it's basically there's an EU law which is from nearly 15-20 years ago, the Facilitators Directive, which is all about the criminalization of irregular entry into the country, irregular stay, and irregular transit. And this is the legislation that's currently being revised. So there was a proposal to change and to update this regulation in 2023. And there are more, let's say, provisions there, more pushes to criminalize even more migration and solidarity, which might also include service provision to undocumented people. This specific proposal is still under negotiation, so we don't yet have the final outcome. Another one that I just put here is the Schengen Border Code. So this is the regulation that basically regulates the internal and external borders of the Schengen area. And what's quite significant here, it was adopted, so this one is finalized. It was adopted in February 2024, but we consider that there will be a much higher risk of increased racial profiling, because basically there's a general prohibition within the regulation to have systematic prohibition of checks, internal checks, but the police can still do random document checks. So they can decide whether they would check someone at the border or not. And this random, we know it has never been random on paper. It's always about who the police would decide looks like a person without valid papers. And so these are usually racialized people that are stopped. So this was one big concern, that it would increase in that way the racial profiling in Europe. That's already a big issue. Another one, of course, is the Pact on Migration and Asylum, which I think you might be more familiar with. Very broad variety of different regulations here. It's a lot about asylum, but it's also a lot about new border procedures, much more fostering of creation of detention centers across Europe, very much fewer safeguards, and even more barriers to access permits outside of asylum. And the one that I'll focus a little bit more in the rest of my time, I see that I'm maybe taking a bit too long, but I promise I shouldn't be done more than 5 more minutes, is the return regulation, or as we call it, the deportation regulation, because this is a regulation that's been proposed this year in March, and it will replace an existing legislation. And it basically, the aim of this proposal is to create a sort of common system for return and readmission of irregular migrants. So I'll come back to this now. I think it's fine. I'll continue to specifically this return regulation. So this one has just started in terms of negotiations, but it's one that is really being prioritized by the different institutions. The basic aim of the proposal is to increase deportation rates. And at the same time, it doesn't at all address why people are undocumented in the first place. So in a nutshell, there are going to be, they want to loosen the rules on which countries people can actually be deported to. So people could be in the future deported to a country where they have never been before, where they've never crossed paths to in. So it's not at all about the country of origin. But there's also a proposal for deportation hubs, so creating centers in third countries where people would be sent to, again, where they have no ties, but also where there is very much more limited ways for the EU to check on what's happening in these deportation hubs. The regulation also, this proposal makes forced deportation the default, so it very much reduces voluntary departures. It includes a lot of punitive measures based on detention and control to ensure that people facing deportation would cooperate and don't abscond, don't leave. And it also introduces detection obligations, which I'll come back to now, or in the next slide afterwards. With Doctors of the World, we released this week actually a paper where we analyzed this proposal from the sort of health considerations, so trying to see what are some of the impacts on healthcare, and our basic conclusion is that this regulation is very much threatening the universal right to health. And so our conclusion and our call to action is for this proposal to be rejected in its entirety. But just to maybe quickly go through the 4 areas that we identified here. The first is the detection measures. So it's for the first time, the European Commission is proposing that there is a specific provision which is requiring countries to put in place detection measures. They don't actually describe what these detection measures can look like, but of course detection is something that all countries already do, and they do it in different ways. So what is detection? Detection is a police raid, for example, in a public space. So, for example, in France earlier this year, in June, they deployed 4,000 police agents to carry out checks across buses and train stations to arrest and detain undocumented people. Another example of what, let's say, a detection measure can look like is much more surveillance and the use of technology to identify people. So the collection of people's personal data in bulk and exchanging them between police forces across Europe, but also the use of biometric identification systems to track people's movements and increase policing of undocumented migrants. And then another example, which I think you will be most familiar with, given Sweden's proposals in the last several years, are reporting obligations. This is another example of what a detection measure could look like. So requiring service providers, including healthcare professionals, teachers, social service staff, to report people who are undocumented and who are using their service or that they come across. So this is one of the big, let's say, provisions that we are quite concerned about, and which we are very much actively advocating against in this regulation. And then another big area, of course, is immigration detention. Again, I won't go into much depth on this one because I shared already, of course, the data on the harm of detention, but there are basically what this proposal is asking for is more detention, longer detention, poorer conditions, very limited review of a person's detention order, no comprehensive access to healthcare, alternatives to detention no longer being mandatory, etc. Perhaps more importantly, well, not more importantly, one big area of concern as well is that it would allow detention of children. So it's not something that's prohibited at all in this proposal. In reality, it's allowed. It can be justified on sort of last resort ground, which in our experience is never last resort. And also using the sort of best interest of the child principle, which is a completely fake sort of principle, because the UN Convention, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and other international bodies have already said that detention of children is never in their best interest, so it should never have been included here. There is no way in which any type of detention for children should be allowed. Then a third bulk that we look at in this paper is everything linked to deportation procedures and operations. And as I've already said, basically we're going to see more forced deportations as a default option and coercive measures, outsourcing to third countries, and actually sort of health and medical needs of people being largely absent in this whole procedure. And the third area that we analyzed and we looked at is around the sharing of health data. And basically, the proposal is very much promoting more sharing of people's personal data between countries within Europe, but also with third countries. So, I don't know, Greece sharing data with Libya, or Sweden sharing data with Morocco or any other country. So this is quite concerning because, of course, it includes any information on vulnerability, health and medical needs, and the sort of consent is extremely weak in terms of how it's formulated in the regulation. In some cases, it would only require informing the person and not gathering the consent. In other cases, consent is included. And then there's a whole question on who gets to decide on transferring that data, and whether that's the national authorities or Frontex. And there's lots of questions as well in terms of yes, the basically privacy rights of people and their data being shared with very limited review or possibilities to say no to that data being shared. We do a lot of advocacy on it. I won't take too long on this. I think if you have any questions on what we're doing, happy to share more. But basically in September, we, together with a broader coalition, we have signed a statement with other 240 organizations calling for the rejection of this proposal and for the European Commission to withdraw and take away the proposal. And so we're just trying to advocate against it, but we do very much realize that it's very difficult right now to do advocacy on this because the political climate is all for more return, more detention, so very few opportunities to very much have an evidence-based discussion with the policymakers and finding alternatives or an inclusive approach. So just to conclude, and sorry for taking so long, in terms of the EU's migration and asylum policy, we see a continued shift to more deterrence, more enforcement, more criminalization, with very severe implications for the right to health, safety of people. And we advocate as PICUM towards the EU and member states to have policies that uphold the right to health and respect medical ethics, promote safe and regular migration pathways, and also very much ensure access to a secure residence permit. Voilà. Thank you so much. I know it's a lot of information, so I'm very happy to answer any questions. Let me stop sharing the screen. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Louise, for trying to present this complex subject. There's so much information, but thank you so much for doing this. We'll see if we have some questions here from the audience. Back there. Try to put the mic close to your mouth so...
Is this close enough?
I think so, yes.
Could you tell us a bit more about these deportation hubs? What would that look like? Where would they be placed? And who would be sent there?
Did you get that?
Yes, I think so. Yes. So the question was about the deportation hubs. So the deportation hubs is a big debate right now, and not all countries are in favor of this, although I think there's more and more favor of it. You've probably read in the news about Italy and the sort of outsourcing also with Albania. So I think it's very much based on this model. According to the proposal itself, basically you would, a country would have to have a sort of bilateral agreement with a third country. So Sweden having, I don't know, an agreement with Rwanda, since the UK also wanted to do this. And so that would be, let's say, the country, or there could be multiple bilateral agreements. And basically then when there would be a return decision, a deportation decision, a person could actually be spending their time in this deportation center that would be based in Rwanda. We have lots and lots of questions around, okay, but then would the EU or the country retain its their sort of responsibility to still be able to, let's say, if the rights are violated of the person, who is actually, which country is still responsible for this, because this, of course, would take place then outside of the EU, with very more difficult oversight, I would say, also from civil society actors to be able to monitor what's happening there. So it could really be in many different countries, and so yeah, I hope that answers a bit the question, because the negotiations are ongoing right now, so the details are really under discussion. Yeah, sorry, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
And also the PowerPoint we can share with you afterwards. And
of course. And if there's more questions, feel free to send me an email.
Great.
I just want to ask you, do you have any help from the UN special rapporteurs or from the EU, the FRA, Agency for Fundamental Rights?
I didn't hear the first word, so do we have any...
Do you have any support? Do you have any connection support discussions with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we try as much as we can, I think, to be in touch. The reality is, for example, on the deportation hub, the Fundamental Rights Agency, right before this proposal came out from the European Commission, released a paper that was saying, here are the conditions which would make a deportation hub fundamental rights compliant. So by releasing this paper, they were already saying it's possible and we are okay with this deportation hub idea in principle. So it's very, it was for us extremely worrying to see that basically this is a concept that is more or less being validated but by the Fundamental Rights Agency, which I think several years ago would not have been the case. So this is on one specific. On other issues, of course, you know, we have lots of data that we use and we do have dialogues with them, but it's, I just wanted to raise it as one of those examples because of the question before on Deportation Hub. So we try and engage. We also, of course, are with UN rapporteurs in touch, but it's, yeah, it's quite challenging right now, the context actually. What I didn't mention also is that this whole proposal was released by the European Commission without any impact assessment. So it was just a really a political priority to do something on return and deportation because this is what the countries want. But there was no real consultation with any sort of civil society or social actors, no impact assessment, so they just released something which does not even follow the EU rules in terms of how you should develop laws and policies at the EU level. So the whole process was extremely concerning, and it's a trend that we're seeing across different migration policies. They are just not doing the normal sort of policy making, better regulations that they should be following.
Okay, thank you so much, Louise, for this presentation. Very interesting. And we will be able to share the PowerPoint, and also we are recording this, so if you want to see it afterwards, we will put it on our YouTube, because there's a lot of information, I think.
Yes, there's a lot of information, I know.
But thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for joining us.